The story I have for you today is one that is centered around a lost play. Now, it's not particularly bad that the play is lost because, as I recall, it wasn't particularly good, but it's a play that I wrote, and I would have been around 11 years old when I wrote the play and when it was actually performed twice at my school, University Lake School, out in Hartland, Wisconsin. And the person who spurred me to actually bring the play to my drama teacher was my dad. And unfortunately, the play wasn't recorded. He tried to get there in time to see my performance, but he wasn't able to make it. But my mother was able to be there, and so she could tell him all about it. Now, what kind of play was it? You could call it a mishmash of perhaps sci-fi and fantasy acted out on the stage with lots of opportunity for sword fighting, so some choreography. And how do you get into this sort of thing? So here's the backstory. In 5th grade at Wales Elementary, I read my first book of Lloyd Alexander's Prydain or Prydain Chronicles, however it's supposed to be pronounced, which is drawing on Welsh mythology and legends and telling this wonderful fantasy tale that is aimed at, children, but can be profitably reread, as I did later on, by adults. And I read the 5th book, which I found in our library, and I was just fascinated by it. It had all the sort of elements that I already liked from, say, The Hobbit or fantasy stuff that I was seeing on TV or in comic books or other stories. And actually, by that time, we'd already had The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe read to us. I remember reading some of the other Narnia books as well, though not the entire series. Much of that would have to wait until middle school as well. So I read this first book, The High King, which was awesome. And I didn't quite understand everything that was going on in it, in part because there was this backstory of other books in it. But then I was able to go back and I kind of read them in a haphazard manner, as I recall. I think the next one that I read was The Black Cauldron, which is the second book in the series. And the main character, although there are a couple other really important characters, is a guy named Taran. And he is a foundling who will go on to become a great warrior and become the High King of this land after he conquers the Lord of the Dead, Arwan, with the great sword that has been stolen, which belonged to the actual king, Gwydion, and he's got a bard friend, Fluter Flam, and there's a beautiful princess who's also a tough girl herself from the Isle of Lir Elanoi, and there's nobody's quite sure exactly what he is, but a kind of hairy, stinky guy named Gurgi, and there's others along the way as well, including the people who bring up Taran. And anyway, long story short, I became fascinated with this. And in 5th grade, in Wales Elementary, because I was considered gifted and talented, and because they had no idea what to do with gifted and talented kids, they basically sent us off to do our own thing. They would say, go to the library and read some books and, do a report, make up a project. Here's some stuff that you can play with. For science class, they often wouldn't include us in the regular science class, and they would give us kits to play with for circuits or, biological things. And there was a gifted, talented coordinator who would come around every once a month or so, Mrs. Bailey, and, we'd see her for an hour, and then that was it. So there was an awful lot of being left to my own devices. And I got really, really interested in, among other things, Lloyd Alexander's Prydain Chronicles, 5 books, right? And loved it and got a hold of them. And I would make maps and have imaginary dialogues in my head. And I don't know where the idea first came to me of writing a play, but that's what I did. Now, was it a play that was very faithful to the source material? No, because what I did have is a bunch of kids from the present day finding what I called a time machine, but it was less of a time machine and more of a let's transport you to an alternate dimension machine that they step through, and it's never very well explained. It's more like a portal than a machine because there's no buttons or anything. And they go through, and now they're in this kingdom. And so, this sort of trope has been done a lot, right? And in the 1970s, we're full of stories like this. And, even some good fantasy is like that. Think about the Complete Enchanter series by Fletcher Pratt and L. Sprague de Camp. Done much better than this sort of thing that I was doing. But in any case, I started writing a play. And in the play, a lot of things happen. Arwan is there, who's the Lord of the Dead, and he's kind of a Darth Vader character. I think a lot of us had Star Wars on the mind, and, same sort of thing, dressed in black, larger than life, scary, evil, threatening, wants to kill all the other characters, or you put them in prison, take them to the land of the dead. And, there was Illinois in it, and I don't remember exactly who else I had. I didn't have the full cast. And then there's these people who come from the present. Now, I started working on this before I started 6th grade, middle school, at University Lake School. And there's a little bit of a story there as well. I'll tell it to you very quickly because I've mentioned it in other places. So I went to a public elementary school, and we lived out in the countryside. So it was pretty rural. As I mentioned, there was a gifted, talented program for the kids who were smart, but it wasn't even a program. It was more like, you guys go over there and do your thing, stay out of our hair. And it was a pretty rough place, Kettle Moraine. Now it's a great school district. Back then it was pretty low down. And, you had a chance to get bullied and beaten up, and there were a lot of tough kids. And what they wanted to do with me was move me from 5th grade right into 7th grade. And I was like, oh, that's going to be terrible. I'm going to get my butt kicked every single day by these bigger kids because they don't like smart kids anyway. So my parents looked around, and they found this private middle school. And it just so happened because of my test scores, I qualified for a scholarship, which is the only way that we could afford for me to go there. And there were some other kids there like me as well. My good friend John and my good friend Steve, they were all scholarship kids as well. And I'll say this about ULS. In general, you were smart or you were rich, and there wasn't much intersection between those two classes. And I think, frankly, that the reason why we scholarship kids were there was to bring up the average test scores so it would look better to people on the outside. And some of these rich kids were like super rich. We'd actually have a state senator who would come and meet with the students. And why would they do that? Because their parents were big contributors. So I was just a kid wearing clothes that my mom sewed at home, or cheap Toughskins, and whatever happened to be the case. I didn't go downhill skiing like these kids, and that was the way it was for my friends as well. But there were some good kids in with these rich kids as well. And one of the really cool things about this school was that drama was part of the curriculum. It was not an option. It was not like you have the drama nerds over there, the theater kids, and then everybody else does their thing. Every single student in 6th and 7th, and maybe even 8th grade, and I don't know what it was like for high school because I didn't go there for high school, every single student took drama. And the classes were small. All of us 6th graders were actually in one class. There were about 25 of us. And we were a class that only had 4 girls. So it's almost all boys and a few girls. The other classes were a little bit more even that way, which worked out good for the play because I didn't have an awful lot of female characters. So every week, drama class, we had to do skits, we had to do improvisational things, we had to work on how to use our bodies, and read lines and things like that. And it was with Mrs. Bicha-Dale, who was the drama teacher and also an English teacher, as I had in, I think, a 7th or 8th grade. And she was married to a guy who was an English teacher as well. So, long story short, I'm writing this play and working on it up in my bedroom, and it's not really ready for prime time, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to show it to anybody. And so what I would do is I would shove it into my desk drawer. So one day, my dad, who was a very, very hard worker, he was a tax attorney, worked here in Milwaukee, at that time an hour commute away on a good day from where we lived, way out in the sticks on the border of Delafield and Wales. And he happened to be, so we had a 2-story house, and you'd go up the stairs, and it was kind of like a horseshoe landing, and my parents' room was over there, and his den was over there until Grandpa moved in and then had that as his room. My sister's room was at one end of the horseshoe and my room was at the other. So my dad poked his head in and he saw me shoving these papers into a desk drawer. And then he was, he was like, well, what is that? And I didn't want to show him. And I did show him, and I could see him reading it. And I was, kind of worried because I thought, well, he's a smart guy, very accomplished. He's going to think this is crap. And so he's reading it, and I remember this very vividly, seeing him with this furrowed expression, reading through it page after page after page. And then he said to me, and he wasn't smiling, "You're going to show this to your teacher." And I was like, oh, crap. So now he doesn't like it, and he thinks I'm wasting my time trying to write plays, and he's going to make me show it to my teacher. And who knows what she's going to think of it. She's probably going to think it's garbage too. Maybe she'll laugh at me. I'll get punished in some way for this. This is terrible, right? What I didn't know is that he actually thought it was really good. And he was, I suppose you could call it tough love of some sort. And so he was, making sure that it would actually get to them. And if I remember right, he said, you have to finish this. And then I didn't end up taking it to the teacher. He ended up taking it to the teacher. I don't know how this scheduling worked out, but he drove in and met with her. And then, the next time we had class, Mrs. Bicha-Dale said, well, we have somebody who's written a play here. It's Greg over there. And it's quite good, for a student work. And I was a 6th grader, right? So what the hell did I know? And she said, we're going to put this play on. And she didn't say, do you think we should put this play on? She didn't leave it up to the students. She said, this is the play that we are doing for this semester. Because every semester we would have to do a play. There were actually 2 plays. There was a play in the class, and then there would also be like a middle school play that you could try out for. I never did any of those. That actually was for the drama theater people who did that more. And in part I didn't do that because it meant like additional time that I'd have to spend at ULS, and it was already enough. But every class we were rehearsing this play. So we had to figure out who's going to be who. And because we had so many students and there weren't that many roles in the play, Mrs. Bicha-Dale said, all right, we're doing 2 productions of this. So production A, production B. And as I mentioned, there was lots of room for sword fights in it. And now part of this, again, I got to tell a little backstory. I was in Cub Scouts. And if you don't know about Cub Scouts, it's sort of like the junior thing for the Boy Scouts. And every month there's like a theme. Like it could be making cars that race down these things, or shooting off model rockets, or it could be like learning how to walk in the woods, or cooking, or stuff like that. And I think it was in either 4th grade or 5th grade, it was knights. And so what we did is we all made like wooden swords or other cool things. Like some people would, make like a ball and chain with a sock and a ball in it and a stick, and they'd spray paint it silver. And we made like shields, and we learned about heraldry and painted the shields. And some of us had potato chip, what would you call them? Like there were these cylindric containers, I guess you'd say boxes. And they were just the right size for putting on a kid's head if you put a little padding in there. So we made helmets, and we had armor that we kind of made up. And it was so cool. And the best thing about it was once we were done with like the official stuff for the pack, you had packs and then dens. Dens were the smaller group, like a squad size and then like a company size. So all of us kids started like having fights with each other, hitting each other with our swords, the shields and stuff like that. This is the kind of stuff that we did in our neighborhood anyway. We would get sticks and try to hit each other, and we'd get like garbage can lids, the old metal ones that we'd bang on each other. And so we were all into this sort of thing. So for me, this play was partly a way to do homage to Lloyd Alexander and his wonderful Prydain Chronicles, but it was also an excuse to do the kind of crap that I love doing anyway. I'd seen Zorro and the Three Musketeers. And I wanted to be a sword fighter. That was one of the things I had in mind at the time. So anyway, we go through production, and, I have to do a couple rewriting little parts of it. Mrs. Bicha-Dale was very helpful with that, giving suggestions about how the play could be improved. And we do the scenery, and we start making costumes, and we start making wooden swords. Except for one boy, George, whose dad actually owned a foundry. George came to class with a metal sword. Now, it wasn't sharp, but it was definitely a metal sword. It was heavy as hell, and it was so cool, right? So, the other thing I'll tell you about sword stuff. So my uncle Aimé, who you may have heard about in some of my other stories, one of my favorite uncles, really cool guy, struggled with bipolar disorder, severe bipolar disorder his entire life. And he lived with my grandparents for a long time, and he had a wood shop in the basement. And Aim was an amazing woodworker and carver. The sorts of things that he could do with wood and tell you about it were just amazing. He also started me carving. He encouraged me and my sister, bought us knives at Christmas, showed us how to use them, how to use a chisel, how to use all the other kinds of tools to make beautiful things out of wood. He also taught me how to do carpentry, put up a stud wall and stuff like that. Anyway, Aim decided that he was going to make me a scimitar. A scimitar is a curved sword. And he did it. He had his saw. He got some good wood. He made me this thing. We painted it silver. I brought it to class, and everyone's like, holy crap, that is a sword. That's amazing, right? Now, I ended up breaking it, getting in a sword fight with George, broke it off at the thing, and he had to stick it back in with some screws and stuff so it didn't look quite the way it was supposed to. By the way, guess which character I was? I didn't play the hero in my particular production. I was Arwan, the Lord of the Dead, the big baddie. And so I got to do lots of sword fighting, of course. That was one of the reasons I wanted that role. Mrs. Bicha-Dale let me pick which role I wanted because it was my play, right? And then she directed all of it. So weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of rehearsal and preparation and getting the scenes ready, and then telling all the parents, okay, the play is going to be put on after school at this time. Show up. You'll get to see your sons and daughters doing their thing in drama class. And of course, my dad, he had to work in Milwaukee, and he tried to get off, but he wasn't a partner. He was in Touche Ross, which was at that time one of the fastest expanding tax accountancy legal entities. They were gobbling up all these other, and so he was up but also down in the food chain, as they say. So he couldn't get off, and I'm watching, and our play went on first, and my mom is there, my sister is there, and we acted out. My dad isn't there, and I'm like, oh crap, he's not going to see it. And of course, they had video recorders at the time, but nobody was video recording it. And then he came in just as the second production was going on, was in process. So he got to see a bit of it, but he didn't get to see me doing that. And he did the best he could, and he was the one who was the catalyst for the play not existing, but getting put on in the first place. So, this is kind of a cool thing. I never actually did write another play after that. I don't know, maybe I'll do that someday. Instead, the playwriting, acting, whatever you want to call it, bug, got passed down to one of my children, my oldest child, Kat, who is going to graduate fairly soon from the theater program here in Milwaukee at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And Kat has been in a number of plays, but also has written plays, way more than I have and way better than I have as well, and has interest and talent for stage combat as well. So it's kind of cool to see how these things don't necessarily just stop and disappear. And I think if my dad was still around, unfortunately, he died when he was only 36. In actually that summer between 6th and 7th grade for me, that was the last year. That was the last opportunity. I think he would have been very proud to see what Kat is doing with theater, and that would be quite cool. So, long story. It looks like it's well over 20 minutes. About this play that got put on once. It's lost. I don't know where the manuscript is. We've moved so many times and so much has been lost over the course of all of these shifting around. Maybe my mom had it somewhere, but unfortunately she died in 2000. So, it's long gone, except perhaps in the glimmer of memory of some people and in your imagination as I'm telling you its story here.